Good to be here. Nice for you to be here too. Hello everyone at home. My name's Denise. Come talk to me afterwards if you haven't already met me. And I will enjoy meeting you. Last week I talked about bodies. And I was going to go on to a different topic this week before we get into our series on Corinthians coming up in 2 weeks' time. Kevin's speaking next week, so you can look forward to that. But I had so much response to the sermon last week that I think we need to unpack it a little more. So here we go with bodies, part 2. So if you were here, you might remember that last week I talked about this concept of how this idea of an immaterial soul trapped in a body is not actually how the Bible sees people. The idea that bodies are bad, I should have made that a lot bigger, shouldn't I? That bodies are bad and the soul is good. I mean, the people online are never going to be able to read that, are they? Oh well. The idea that bodies are bad and the soul is good, that's kind of this Greek concept that crept into Christianity in its earliest centuries. And this Greek influence has resulted in this idea that bodies really don't matter. What matters is souls. That's the bit of us that leaves the body and sort of floats up to heaven when we die, or, I don't know, maybe down to hell if we've ticked off God. And I said last week that this idea, which is foreign to the Bible, has led to one of 2 ways of living. So one is that if the body's inferior to the soul, and one way of living is to go to extreme lengths to master the body. So we whip it into shape. We make sure that it doesn't cause us to fall into temptation. We punish it if it gets out of hand. The other way, if it's the soul that's important and not our bodies, is to do whatever we like with our bodies. Because the actions we do in our bodies, well, it doesn't really matter, does it? What matters is that we're very spiritual in our souls. But we found out last week that the Bible has this very different view of people, and doesn't really reflect that idea at all. We're not immaterial souls trapped in material bodies, but we are whole people. We're one integrated being, and who we are includes our bodies just as much as it includes any other part of us, if in fact we could divide ourselves up into parts. So bodies matter, and how we view our bodies, how we treat our bodies, it matters. And so I finished by saying that this was a risky sermon to do, because many of us have uncomfortable relationships with our bodies. And the last thing that I want to do is cause harm to anyone, anybody. And finally, I said that the church urgently needs a theology of the body that takes into account the experiences of diverse people. People with physical disabilities, people who are trans, people who have experienced abuse of the body. And I'm sure that you could think of a lot of other, categories, if you want to use the word, of people for various reasons that have this kind of uncomfortable relationship with their bodies. As I said, I got quite a bit of response from this sermon. One person said, and I've used all of this with permission, one person said, I really wish that I didn't have to interact with the world in this body. For this person, being a disembodied spirit seemed like a pretty good option. Another person felt very unsettled by the idea that they might be forever stuck with some version of the body they have because their body has health issues. And that's created all sorts of problems for them. They don't like being limited by their body. Their body has let them down really badly, and they would just be happy to leave it behind. Another person shared that they felt disconnected from their body because they'd been taught that denying themselves was a Christian virtue. And that meant constantly denying the needs and the wants of their body. They'd been taught that anything that pleased the self is considered selfish. So even close connections with friends was to be discouraged because that might distract you from your relationship with God. Years of ignoring their body led to them being unable to perceive whether they feel tired or hungry or stressed. And that's led, over the long term, to all sorts of health issues. You can see why this topic is important. Others wondered about what happens after we die. Does the body just sort of rot in the ground until Jesus comes? Like, what happens then? And someone made the interesting observation that the Bible says some people have shown hospitality to angels without knowing it, presumably because those angels showed up as a body. And that's a whole new can of worms to ponder. What I really appreciated is that people want to talk about this stuff. People shared deeply and vulnerably on this whole issue. And people have invited me to ask them questions to better understand what it's like to be in a body that doesn't feel like it fits the core of who they are. And I love that because the way forward to a healthy theology and a healthy church is to listen to each other's perspectives and experiences. As a survivor of sexual abuse, child sexual abuse, I spent more years than I care to remember feeling uncomfortable in my body. You see, it's better to live in your head, isn't it? Because living in your body is dangerous. And living an embodied existence exposes you to pain and trauma and grief. But in the long run, it doesn't really work to spend your life in your head because there's a whole world out there waiting to be explored, a life waiting to be lived, and that life can only be lived in a body. I know for me, it was really helpful to find things that got me out of my head and into my body. So Drew and I tried ballroom dancing. We were terrible at it. We were really terrible at it. We did it for a few months. It was kind of fun, though. When my son took up drumming, I found myself feeling envious of this whole drumming thing. There was something about it that drew me. And so I took up drumming lessons. I did secret drumming lessons for 5 months. I didn't tell anyone. It was fun. I'm not great at drumming. I'm not ready to go on the road. I've thought about it, but maybe not. But I loved it. Like hitting things hard and making really loud noises. That's what drumming is, right? Got any drummers here? Because that's kind of insulting to say to drummers. But that sense of creating rhythm and becoming part of the music, I discovered that once you get past that initial counting the drum beats in your head, you drum better if you stop thinking and let your hands and feet just take over. Drumming gets me out of my head and into my body. It's a really helpful thing to do. Probably the thing that helped me most is mindfulness meditation. So most days I sit. I sit for at least 20 minutes and I listen to the sounds around me. I listen to the creaks in the colorbond roof as the sun heats it up. I hear the faint hum of an overhead plane, or maybe someone talking in the next room. I pay attention to what I physically feel in my body, a full feeling in my head because I've got so many whirling thoughts in there, the light pressure of my fingers resting on my knees, maybe a sense of sadness somewhere in my chest, or maybe a sense of joy, depending on what's happening in life. Paying attention to your body is incredibly relaxing. In fact, some days I end up so relaxed that I can barely stand up out of the chair. I kid you not. I've been doing this for 5 or 6 years now, and contrary to many people's fears, I'm fairly confident that I haven't become demon-possessed as a result of doing mindfulness meditation. Now, maybe give me a heads up if you can see something that I can't see, please. But I find I'm much more in tune with my body. So paying attention to your body is not incompatible with Christian faith, and any theology that says it is, I think, is harmful. God created this physical universe and he filled it with physical bodies. And God said, it is good. Importantly, the body's picture of the world beyond this one, the age that is to come, as the Bible sometimes calls it, is also a physical world where people live in physical bodies. So one passage, our passage today that Jono read, it has this tantalising glimpse of Paul's understanding of bodies, both the ones that we have at present and the resurrected ones that he seems to think we'll have in the world to come. You're probably not going to be able to read this either, but that's okay because I'm going to read it for you. Therefore, we do not despair, but even if our physical body is wearing away, our inner person is being renewed day by day. For our momentary light suffering is producing for us an eternal weight of glory, far beyond all comparison. Because we are not looking at what can be seen, but at what cannot be seen. For what can be seen is temporary, but what cannot be seen is eternal. Now, if we come to that passage with our ancient Greek glasses on, this belief that we're souls trapped in bodies, then that passage seems to confirm our view. Our physical body is wearing away, but our inner person is being renewed. Doesn't that just prove that it's the inner spiritual soul that matters and not that outward physical body? For what can be seen is temporary, but what cannot be seen is eternal. Aren't these verses saying that outward things like bodily things don't matter? It's the spiritual things, the soul, that matters. But this is not a contrast between the physical and the non-physical. It's a contrast between this present world and the future world to come. Do you see the difference? Things in this present world, they don't last very long. They decay, they get old, they rust, they break down. A few of us could testify to that. So look around. What you see is temporary, because what you see belongs to this present world. But there's more to reality than this present world. There's a future world coming, and you can't see it clearly yet, although there are glimpses of it all around, especially if we pay attention. And that coming world will not pass away. Things in it, bodies in it, will not pass away, will not decay, will not rust and break down. The Bible doesn't portray this future world as this sort of ghostly, non-physical, immaterial world. On the contrary, it's even more physical than this world. This is the Christian hope. Oh, whoops. No, it's not when we die we go to heaven. Right, sorry. The Christian hope is that a time is coming when there will be a new creation, a second creation, one in which the physical world is restored in all of its beauty, where volcanoes won't contaminate a community's water supply, where no child goes hungry, where no one feels alone, where no one suffers from ill health, and where, because resurrected bodies don't wear out like they do in this present world. It's about who they are, where the outer matches the inner self. And just by the way, our job as Christians is to live as if that world was here now. But that's another sermon topic, and I'm not going to go there tonight. The next thing that Paul says is kind of confusing, but it's very typical of Paul, and that's the reading that we heard tonight. It's confusing because, well, why use one metaphor when you can use 4 or 5? So in 2 Corinthians 5, verses 1 to 5, Paul moves from metaphors of houses, temples, tents, clothes and bodies, and he mixes them all up. He talks about our bodies as being like a tent that's going to be destroyed, or maybe a better way of saying it is dismantled. And that's okay because there's this building from God that's eternal and it's in the heavens, is what Jono said. Well, what is this all about? It's hard to understand because unless you know a significant piece of Old Testament history, you can miss it. But there's a period of time where the Israelites wandered in the desert after they'd been rescued from slavery in Egypt, and they hadn't yet entered their homeland. And in that 40 years of wandering, they worshipped God in a tent. It was called the tabernacle. And this tent, tabernacle, it was dismantled every time they moved on. It was a sacred and holy structure, but it was always designed to be temporary. And it worked while they wandered in the wilderness because they could take it with them wherever they went. But it was never meant to be permanent. Tents are temporary structures. When they finally got to their homeland, the place where they were always journeying towards, the place where they truly belonged, a more permanent and a more glorious structure was built. The temple. Maybe you can see now how Paul's metaphor works. Paul is saying that our bodies now are like the tabernacle, holy, sacred, not bad, but temporary. And just as the tabernacle was a foreshadowing of the temple, so our temporary bodies that grow old and wear out will one day be replaced with a more permanent arrangement, a resurrected body that doesn't grow old or weary. This house not built by human hands is waiting in the heavens, the passage says. Paul seems to be saying it's already been prepared. It's kind of like a prop in a stage play. It's ready to be pulled out and used when the time comes for the tent to be dismantled. And then Paul switches metaphors to the idea of putting on clothes, because Paul likes mixing metaphors. So clothes now become the metaphors for our bodies, both the temporary body and the more permanent body. So living with this earthly body, he says, causes us to groan because of the burdens that come with the temporary body. Anybody been groaning because of your temporary body? We long to be clothed with this more permanent body, prepared and waiting for us in the heavens. The fact that it's waiting in the heavens doesn't imply that our disembodied soul floats up to the heavens. This is exactly what Paul isn't saying. He doesn't want us to be unclothed, because unclothed would be that Greek concept, a soul without a body. He doesn't want us to be unclothed, he wants us to be further clothed. he says. The image is of someone who's wearing jeans and t-shirt, but because it's cold outside, they go and put on more clothes, a warm, comfy jacket and a beanie, and they put those clothes over their existing clothes. And so Paul says what is mortal gets swallowed up or maybe covered up by resurrection life. So Paul wasn't longing for the time when he could be a disembodied soul floating around in the heavens, freed from his body. What he was longing for was for his temporary, worn-out body that was suffering to be replaced or maybe swallowed up by a renewed resurrection body that will live in a renewed and restored creation, a new heaven and a new earth. I know that's an awful lot to take in, and I'm not sure whether those glances are just like, whoa, what? And sometimes I forget that I'm supposed to be preaching to a congregation and not lecturing to a whole bunch of theological students who were used to, like, you know, new concepts coming at them. So while your brain is just sort of catching up, I almost feel like we need a question time or something. But while your brain is catching up, I'd like to emphasise that I'm not just making this stuff up. So I've been particularly influenced this week by the work of a few New Testament scholars. Paula Gooder, I mentioned her last week. She wrote a book called Body, Biblical Spirituality for the Whole Person. Really worth a read if you're interested in this stuff. And also a commentary on 2 Corinthians from N.T. Wright's Paul for Everyone series, and that's also really accessible. But I'm hoping I can squeeze one more idea in before finishing. And this is from N.T. Wright. He says, in this passage that we're looking at tonight, heaven is not the place we go when we die, but rather the place where God has our future bodies already in store for us. And we do a great disservice to the gospel if we reduce the Christian hope to going to heaven when you die, as if that's what Christianity is all about. Wright, and let's hope he's not wrong, says that heaven means the place where the divinely intended future of the world is kept safely in store. Maybe I should say that again. He says heaven means the place where the divinely intended future for the world is kept safely in store. Almost like the backstage of a theatre where the props are kept. And when it's time for the scene change, when this present age comes to an end, these props will be brought out from the wings and set in place for the final, glorious, eternal scene of God's creation. And that's the picture that we have in the final chapter of Revelation. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and earth had passed away. And I saw the holy city descending out of heaven from God. Here come the props. And I heard a voice say, "Look, the residence of God is among people. God will live among them, and they will be God's people, and God will be with them. God will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death will not exist anymore, nor mourning, nor crying, nor pain, for the former things have ceased to exist." Well, as always, I don't expect you to swallow everything I say. I could be wrong about all sorts of things. So take from this sermon what you find helpful and leave the rest behind. And again, if this sermon has raised issues for you that you'd like to talk through, or if you'd like to share your perspective on bodies with me, I'd really love to catch up. And I've got heaps of time this week and next. So if you email me, mccbrisbanepastor@gmail.com, I'd love to respond.